computations and brains of it are right over there, and this is just a remote. This is the TC Electronics Multi-Effects Unit. It can have up to 4 independent effects engines in it, which means it can be doing 4 completely different effects settings with its own inputs and outputs. They can be analog or digital. So this hardware over there is configurable. You can order it with a certain number of analog cards or digital cards, or you don't have to have 4 effects engines in it. If you want to start cheap with just 1 and then add as you go, you can do that. This particular unit has 3. It has 3. We don't have the 4th one. We've got 3 engines in it, so it can do 3 completely independent effects, although it has an extra slot here. E4 is not used. These E's are the effects engines, effects 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 1, 2, and 3 are used, and 4 is not. Let me get back here. This is when you power it up, and you have to power it up right here. It takes a couple of minutes to establish communication with the brain over there. But this is the screen that you get. And there's a few things you need to know on how to configure this, or else it won't work. It really is irritating that it doesn't retain all of its routing and everything like that when you power it off, so you have to go through this procedure every time, but that's the way it goes. This is a touch screen, so the first thing you do is touch this. This is not a touch screen here, so I see people going, come on. But just to show you, the first thing you do is touch this icon over here, beep, and it brings up your main screen.
Does that mirror that?
Yes, this is just this display here.
Okay.
Now the first thing you need to do, again, this can have all kinds of routing. This can be a 5.1 effects unit. So even though this is just E1 for effects unit number 1, it could be a 5.1 output. So there's a ton of inputs and a ton of outputs on these things. So you have to tell them how you're going to use them. Now, for this discussion, we're really only using a stereo output. We're not going to get into the 5.1 output yet, so you don't have to worry about that. We also generally use effects as a mono in and stereo out. Because we use them off of aux sends in parallel form, we don't really need to send it a true stereo input. If we were using it serial, so our stereo signal was passing through it, we need to use the stereo input. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're using the SSL board, just like you would on the Ghost board or anything else. We're using a mono aux send into the unit, and it's outputting a stereo signal. So with that in mind, here's what you have to remember. Where do these signals hit the patch bay? Because again, we've got 16 ins and 16 outs on these that can be configured however you want. So where do they hit the patch bay? Because you have to choose, you have to configure these outputs correctly for all of these 3 engines so that they show up in the patch bay. So here's what you need to know. Input number 9. Okay, let me back up. Over here on the patch bay, it's labeled TC6000 A, B, and C. Why it's labeled A, B, and C? I don't know.
Because A, B, and C for 1, 2, and 3.
I know, but it should be 1, 2, and 3 because that's what this screen says. So you have to remember it's A, B, C over there in the patch bay and not 1, 2, 3. So the input for machine number 1 is 9. The output for machine number 1 is 9 and 10. If you patch it that way, and I'm going to do that so you can see how that's done, if you patch the input to 9 and the output to 9 and 10, it will show up correctly over here. Now, because this is internally patchable, you could patch it so that it shows up incorrectly. You could patch machine number 1 into C over there because you've got all this patching here. But in order for it to show up the way it's labeled, you patch 9 into machine 1 for the input. The output of machine 1, because these are inputs here from the patch bay. Okay. This is inputs from the patch bay here, 9 to machine 1, output of machine 1 to 9 and 10. And when you do that, it shows up as labeled on the patch bay. Now, I'm going to go through this, so we're not done with this. You'll get to see how this works. 11, machine 2 input. 11 and 12, machine 2 output. 13, machine 1 or machine 3 input. 13 and 14, machine 3 output. So, these are motorized sliders, and they can do a bunch of different types of functions. When I'm routing the inputs and outputs, that's what they are configured to do. So I'll show you what I mean. Now right now we're looking at this screen, but it's not doing anything yet. We're looking at the screen, but it's not doing anything because we need to hit route. We need to tell it what the function we're doing right now is routing these signals. So I hit route on the touch screen. Now all of a sudden this shows some commands here, and if you notice on the remote they're right above the faders. You can't see it obviously on the screen, but they're right above the faders here. So it says what these faders are doing at that moment. So now the first thing I want to do is grab this first fader. It says source. And as I move that fader down, it patches the physical inputs to that machine. So I could patch any of these physical inputs to the input of machine 1. But what I said earlier was it's 9 on the patch base. So we want that to come down to 9.
So the only ones working on the patch bay are 9, 11, 13,
well,
13?
Yes. The 9 and 10 are working. 11 and 12 are working. 13 and 14 are working. The only time you would use a stereo input is if you were patching this in serial fashion, in line, where you had a stereo signal going through the unit. But